tarde a todas e todos. Só para facilitar, eu também chamo Ricardo, sou Ricardo Madeira. A gente já teve 2 Ricardos aqui, então vocês podem entender um pouco como que é o meu dia a dia. Falando em decifrar evidências, as coisas podem nos confundir. A gente tem aí os nossos nomes aí na interação de trabalho do dia a dia. Bom, antes de entrar aqui na continuação da nossa jornada e a apresentação da mesa, tem algumas questões de ordem aqui de funcionamento que eu queria trazer para vocês. A primeira delas é que no crachá de vocês tem um QR Code em que vocês podem acessar todas as informações do seminário e, em particular, as biografias de todos os palestrantes do evento. Tá? Então, a gente tomou uma decisão aqui, até porque a gente tem palestrantes com longas biografias, então, para tornar a dinâmica mais produtiva, vocês podem consultar a biografia de todos eles lá. Né? Depois tem outro ponto importante, né, sobre algo que não entrou aí na programação, pelo menos em parte da programação que foi divulgada, né, que é a fala do Luiz Roberto Cury, do Conselho Nacional de Educação, sobre a formação de professores, desafios e perspectivas, que vai acontecer logo depois dessa mesa aqui. Tá? Bom, espero que vocês estejam tão estimulados e animados como eu com as discussões que a gente viu até aqui. E o movimento que a gente faz agora é um movimento de foco da discussão que a gente procura discutir com mais intensidade, que é como a gente leva as lições que a gente aprendeu aqui nessas 3 primeiras falas, né, sobre os desafios de usar evidência num campo um pouco mais macro, né, seja na esfera política, ou seja na esfera da política pública, da decisão, tomada de decisão da política pública, como o PB trouxe, para o contexto dos processos pedagógicos que são absolutamente nucleares, né, à gestão educacional. Né. Então, conversando aqui com os palestrantes, né, um pouco sobre a discussão que a gente espera promover, a gente pode imaginar, né, que, seja, olhando para uma Secretaria de Educação, né, e para as suas instâncias, as suas atividades e seu processo de planejamento das suas atividades de gestão, tem meio aqui que uma matriz tridimensional que pode organizar um pouco isso para a gente. Né? A gente pode pensar sobre o uso de dados e evidências em diferentes instâncias da gestão, né? Então, desde a instância da escola, onde você está próximo do dia a dia e daquele fazer pedagógico da sala de aula. Você pode pensar na camada intermediária das regionais, que tem a função de acompanhamento e assistência técnica e diálogo permanente com as escolas sobre os seus vários desafios, sobretudo os desafios pedagógicos, e olhar para a secretaria que organiza esses processos e como eles descem, né, até as escolas e como elas pensam isso de forma mais estruturada. Esse é um jeito. Né? A outra forma que você pode pensar no problema tem a ver com etapas clássicas da gestão. Né? Então, aí tá. Gestão tem certas etapas clássicas. Uma delas é diagnóstico, a outra é planejamento, a outra é algum grau de monitoramento e acompanhamento, como bem o Ricardo Henriques falou na fala dele, como no processo de readequação de decisões e reconfigurações de rotas que a gente tem que fazer como uma organização que se pressupõe a aprender sempre para melhorar os seus resultados. E a outra dimensão que a gente pode olhar é a dimensão das atividades, né? Que acabam atravessando também todas as instâncias. Então, se a gente pensar nas atividades de formação das equipes pedagógicas, coordenadores pedagógicos, professores, então, onde é que o dado tem valor nisso? Nas atividades que estão ali mais próximas à escola, dos pequenos ajustes dentro da missão da entrega curricular ao longo do ano, como é que você faz isso olhando para o dado? Qual dado tem valor? Né? Qual o nível de estrutura desse dado? Quanto que ele precisa estar organizado? Como ele entra nas interações humanas e nas formas de organização das escolas e das redes? Então, é sobre isso que a gente vai falar agora. Né? A gente tem 3 convidados aqui de instituições internacionais. A Paula Louzano, aqui à minha esquerda, da Universidade Diego Portales, do Chile. A gente tem a Constance A, da Universidade da Carolina do Norte, nos Estados Unidos. A gente tem o Fernando Carnaúba, da Escola de Educação da Universidade de Stanford. E a gente tem a Rachel Loughton, colega do Fernando, da Escola de Educação da Universidade de Stanford. Então, eu passo aqui a fala, começando pela Constance. Constance, por favor.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. Duolingo has failed me, so I will not attempt any Portuguese. But I'm really excited. This is my first time in Brazil. So should we stand, sit? What do you guys think? I guess I can stand for this part of the presentation, and I'll take this off. So today I'm going to present some of the work that we have where we are using large administrative data sets and other types of data to explore the role of race in education in the U.S. context. And this work builds on some of the other studies that we have where we talk about the impact of having a same race teacher on Black students in particular. So there's a growing body of evidence in the US context that myself and others have contributed to that really shows that teacher diversity matters for students of color and for Black students in particular. It matters for standardized test scores, for discipline, for other discretional placements, so things like gifted education in the US context, special education, and then long run outcomes. My colleagues and I have a paper where we show that for young Black boys in particular, if they have a Black teacher early on, they're less likely to drop out of high school and more likely to attend college. But these studies kind of point us to some underlying mechanisms, right? So like I said, we use these very large data sets to explore these questions. And so we can establish the relationships, but it's harder to see the underlying mechanisms. So some of the work I'm going to present today is really trying to understand why we see these relationships and how we can use that information to make schools better for kids. So these studies point to some underlying mechanisms that we're going to think about today. So there might be a cultural mismatch between teachers and students. When you have a same race teacher, it might be a role modeling effect. And you might also think of Black teachers as protective agents for Black students. At least in the US context, we know that there is some systemic discrimination and implicit bias that happens. And so Black teachers might be sort of a mitigator or someone who eliminates those biases for Black students. My colleagues and I published a book where we sort of did a summary of all the evidence on teacher diversity and student success. And we kind of talk about the history of how we came to have a not very diverse workforce in the U.S. context, and it sounds like there's some similar trends in the Brazilian context as well. But in the short term, our teacher workforce is largely white and female, and so we started to ask ourselves the question of what could we do with the workforce we have now to think about making them better teachers for all students. So in this study, we asked the question of how teachers learn to become more effective with students of color over time, and in particular thinking about white teachers because they make up the majority of our workforce. And so we wanted to look at some potential mechanisms. So we thought about experience teaching Black students, experience working with Black teachers, and then other formal and informal opportunities for learning in the school context. And as we're sort of here thinking about the use of data and the use of evidence, what we really wanted to do for this project, which is actually it's funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, which is, if you're familiar with the U.S. context, it's an arm of the U.S. Department of Education. But basically, we wanted to use those big, large administrative data sets and then complement them with interview data, right? With the idea that there's some things you can learn on the quantitative side, and there's also things that you can learn on the qualitative side. So we asked a series of questions about basically how teachers learn racial competency, which is basically the skill of being able to teach people who aren't like you. So there's a few sort of categories that we investigated. So the first is learning by doing. And so this is a literature that you might be familiar with, which basically says that teachers become more effective over time. We don't know much about the mechanisms, but we know that sort of the more experience a teacher gets, the better he or she is at being effective with students. And we know that, so since we don't know sort of the underlying mechanism, we do know that there's different sort of dimensions to this effectiveness. So when teachers stay in the same type of classroom, that experience is very valuable for them. If they stay in the same grade, that's also very valuable for them. And for example, if they teach sort of special types of students, so in the US context, there's evidence around if you're teaching English language learners, students who are new to English or for whom English is not their native language, if you teach them over time, you get better at teaching them. We also know that teachers accumulate 2 types of human capital while they're on the job. So sort of the broad teaching experience, and then sort of the more specific teaching experience that I just talked about. So in this first part of the study, we use North Carolina administrative data. So basically, the Department of Public Instruction in North Carolina keeps a longitudinal data set of all the students in North Carolina, and they make it available to researchers. And what's very nice is you can link students to classrooms, to teachers, and you can investigate a whole host of things. So I actually owe the children of North Carolina a lot, particularly putting in my tenure application next year. So I can't pay them all, but I owe them a lot. So basically what we do for this first set of analyses is we look at Black students of new white teachers, and we basically look and see what are the outcomes for these students. And so each classroom was about a quarter Black. The average total experience of the teachers teaching these particular students was about 11 years. And then we just estimate some different levels of experience. So again, what's really nice about this particular data set is it has things like teacher licensure, where they went to school, how long they've been working in the field. And so we can use all of those variables in our analyses. And so we look at the total numbers of general experience, grade-specific experience, and then how much experience they have actually teaching Black students. And I won't bore you with the model. It's the standard value add model that we use to estimate outcomes, or education production function, however you want to think about it. And basically we find that experience matters, having additional grade experience matters, and then having race-specific experience matters, particularly for these novice white teachers. So basically what we're sort of showing empirically is that for young white teachers, if they have when they get more and more experience teaching Black students, they become better teachers of those Black students on standardized test score outcomes. So teacher experience positively affects student outcomes, and then when we're controlling for everything, we still find this effect. Okay, so then we said, what happens when teachers can learn from their peers? So we also know that there's some literature that says that teacher peer effects are very important. So who you're working with, how you're learning from those peers. And in this case, effective, we mean, ability to grow on standardized test scores. But we also wanted to investigate this question for what happens if you are a teacher working with a diverse team. And so we use sort of the same types of analyses to ask that question. So same thing, we have about 300,000 Black students from 1996 to 2018 who are in 4th and 5th grade classrooms. About 40% of those teachers, so 40% of those white teachers had a 1 grade Black peer. And on average, about 20% of them had a Black peer over time. So we do something similar. I'm not going to spend too much time on the model. You can download the paper. It's on the NBR website. But basically what we find is that for all teachers, we don't see much, right? If I'm a white teacher and I have a Black peer, we don't really find anything on standardized test scores. Where we do find an effect is for new white teachers. And that is, if they have a Black peer and they are teaching Black students, they are getting higher test scores from those Black students. So some learning is happening somehow from having these diverse educator teams. So just to recap that, we see that these novice white teachers really benefit from working on diverse teams. And we think that there's a mechanism around learning. So to supplement all of this, we then turned to qualitative analysis, where we actually interviewed about 33 teachers in the North Carolina context. And what we did was we did open-ended, in-depth interviews of teachers. We first started off with a pilot process. So we asked lots of questions around, what do you think about race? Where did you learn to think about race? And you guys know this, in the U.S. context, it's very fraught. We started this project in summer of 21, and in summer of 21, everything in the U.S. exploded when it came to race. And so it was very difficult to ask these questions, because this is when some of in the media, they began to talk about things like critical race theory, and there was a lot of debate over what should be taught in classrooms, and those were the exact things we were asking about. So both recruiting teachers in the study and also getting them to answer these very sensitive questions was pretty difficult. But we did it. So we completed the pilot interviews, and we really learned that people were not being forthcoming about how race was playing out in their day-to-day lives at school. So we actually had to change the interview questions to get a little bit more information on that. So we interviewed 20 more teachers after that, and that's allowed us to really supplement those large data sets and econometric models with actual lived experiences of teachers. And so it truly is a mixed method study, and what I think is a good use case of evidence. So in this case, the qualitative analysis is based on teacher interviews from teachers who are in diverse schools, which isn't too hard to do in North Carolina. It's pretty, in terms of U.S. states, it's pretty diverse. It's about, I don't want to do wrong numbers, but it's a diverse state. It actually has a growing population of Latinx students, and so, or Latinx Hispanic students, and so one of the interesting questions will be to see how relationships are playing out for them, although we don't talk about that in this study. So we ended up with a sample of 33 teachers. And so basically, I'll just give you sort of a preview of the findings. This is also available as a working paper, which I can email you if you're interested. But we used these in-depth, semi-structured interviews, had a team of grad students who went out, and each interview took about an hour and a half. And we asked teachers all sorts of things. So, where did you do your teacher preparation? What inspired you to get into teaching? What kinds of schools do you teach in? And how do you learn about race? And how do you learn about how to teach diverse kids? And so we basically found that learning was happening both informally and formally for these teachers trying to learn about race, but they really expressed some concerns about outside political factors sort of coming into the school and preventing them from doing some of the things that they wanted to do. And so we found a few things that sort of bolstered the quantitative results in the qualitative results. Let me go back. So first, teachers sought out, so white teachers in particular sought out older Black teachers to learn from. And there was also sort of an exchange of information about how to teach particular types of students, especially around things like discipline, other sort of cultural mismatch issues that were extremely sort of relevant for the young white teachers. We also found that the formal programming that schools put together for those teachers wasn't as useful as the informal experiences they were able to gather from their colleagues. We also put together some theorized sources of learning, and this is a model that we're still thinking about, so if you have feedback on it, please give it to me. But basically, we say there's sort of three broad sources where these teachers get this learning about race from, and they happen both through formal and informal channels. And there's also moderating contextual factors. And again, that just emerged as we were sort of from the political time period that we started this study and that we're operating in, which just meant that in the case of being sort of a novice or experienced teacher, things might change for you. School culture and climate was very important, so that also includes the role of the principal. And then finally, out-of-school factors. So things like the school board, parents, those outside political pressures that made it very challenging for these teachers to do their job, particularly when it came to issues around race. And so here's a quote. I won't read, well, I guess I'll read it to you. And so this is a teacher talking about outside politics. And so the teacher, when asked about, how are you thinking about race and how you're using it in your classroom, they said, the outside culture and current events is definitely a factor that influences my teaching. It is pushed by the nature of current events, courageous conversations in the classroom, and my fifth grade kids hear what's going on, and it's not like kindergarten or first grade where you can pretend it's not happening. So, on multiple ends of the spectrum, we have racial violence that has really pushed courageous conversations about race and safety and about bias. Those factors have influenced the climate of the classroom, and then also my literacy instruction and culturally responsive nonfiction text and representative novels, and all of that has been very much influenced by what my kids are telling me and what I know the outside world is telling them. And again, when we started this, we weren't expecting some of these results. So basically, we found that most of the learning around race happens from these informal peer interactions, and that kind of bolsters some of the quantitative results that we found earlier. And we also sort of saw that when there were formalized opportunities, they really had to focus on race for them to be helpful for students or for teachers. So I'll wrap up there. If you have any questions or comments, you can shoot me an email, and I think we're also going to have a question section too. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Constance. Antes de passar para o Fernando e para a Rachel, só duas outras informações. A primeira é que vocês viram que a apresentação da Constance estava em inglês, a gente vai depois disponibilizar uma tradução da apresentação. A outra é que vocês podem usar o QR Code, que eu mencionei, para fazer perguntas. Então, terminando as apresentações, a gente vai abrir aqui para um debate de 20 minutos. Tá? E aí eu vou estar recebendo as perguntas de vocês, compilando e passando aqui para os palestrantes. Então, Fernando, Rachel, vocês...
Well, welcome. I was told that I can sit or stand up, but in my case, there's no difference. Come on. But thank you, Kenneth, for doing this in English. I didn't need this. And Fernando and I are going to try and actually do a bilingual presentation, which is why I have to keep the notes here so that I can see when he's talking, when I'm talking, although we practiced it many times. So let me start to say that our topic is practice-based and practice-informed and evidence-based pedagogical management. And to start, I would just like to make sure that, kind of the... Yeah, okay. Technology is not my good side. I also will like to present a sociological lens on education and on educational institutions as well as organizations. And we will talk about teaching as a profession, because teaching is a profession that makes all the other professions possible. And then we're going to talk in more detail about what was the topic of our talk, how decisions are being made that are data informed and evidence based. And we will give you a case study of a program that is quite well known here in Brazil. And thank you, Paula, for making that initiative many years ago. I also wanted to present myself and say that, kind of legitimize the fact that I can be here and to talk to this illustrious audience. Phew. Some of you might know because this book is also translated into Portuguese, and the publisher told me that it sells quite well. But at the beginning of my scholarly work, I was part of the research and the development of an educational pedagogical methodology called complex instruction. And also, in the second part of my professional activities, I was the director of the Stanford Teacher Education Program for 15 years. And as my colleague Linda Darling-Hammond introduced me once to an audience almost at this size, she said, and this is Rachel Latan, and she used to be 2 meters tall before she started the job. But what I learned through all these years, and we even developed kind of a theory around it, what makes teacher education programs, both pre-service and in-service, particularly effective and coherent? And we came up with 3 principles. Number 1, in teacher education, the outcomes of teacher education, measured by how long are the graduates going to stay in their career. And if it's more than 5 years, we're already doing pretty well. How are they going ahead in their careers? Are they taking on leadership roles? What is the quality of their teacher and their productivity and so on? And there is solid data and research evidence that the outcome of teacher education programs is related to the connection between scholarship and practice. In other words, what the students get at the university actually is quite related to what happens in the classroom. In the Stanford education program, the teacher candidates spend half a day, early morning till about 12 or 1 o'clock, in the schools, working with what we call a cooperating teacher. Then they came to the university and start from 3 to 6 to be in classes. And once a week on Wednesday, they also have meetings with their supervisor who has visited in the classroom. On Wednesday, the supervisor sits with a group in the same subject area, and they talk about what the supervisor saw in the classroom and also other kinds of issues that they want to talk about. This connection between scholarship and practice, for example, is very visible when it isn't there. Because, for example, one of the findings globally, I spoke with many teacher education programs, is that teachers, very few, and I remember our program was among very rare ones, that actually had a topic on classroom management. And teachers complained the most about the fact that nobody ever taught them about what to do on managing the classroom, which is why in STEP we actually did initiate a class that had to do with the practicum. So in order to make this work, to make the connection between the university and the schools, we have been convincing both the schools and the universities that preparing teachers is the joint work, the together work of the university and the schools. Emphasis on joint. And finally, for me particularly because of the connection to complex instruction, it was really important to say that equity and excellence are interdependent. It's not or, it's both. Because equity is not really, is not really equity if it isn't visible for everybody else. And excellence is not really excellence if it only is demonstrated for a limited strata of society. A University of Oslo study looked at 6 universities, plus 1, 2 universities in the United States, 2 universities in Norway, 2 universities in Finland, and 1 university in Cuba. They visited the universities, they interviewed the professors, the students, they watched the classrooms. They did some very, very serious studies. And I'm very proud to say that the Stanford Teacher Education Program had the highest scores on all the dimensions of coherence. And the study is a study published to this day on the site of the University of Oslo in Norway called the CATE study. Okay, so our way of thinking about it is that we are starting with the classroom because that's where the action is. And we look at what happens with the students and the teachers, who are then, of course, part of many classrooms are embedded in schools, who are then under the auspice of municipal or regional institutions, who then become part of the state, of course, are part of the state, and finally of the federal government. And just like in the United States, I also know that in Brazil, there are these kind of institutions that are embedded in one another, and therefore we're going to look at them that way. Okay, so we come to the sociology part. And here, I just want to mention that traditionally, the explanations for students' outcomes are based on are based on theories that bring explanations about individuals. And those explanations then are such that outcomes, meaning what the scores are, what the successes are explained by individual characteristics. What's the student's motivations? What are the habits? What are some of the individual differences? What backgrounds, social, cultural, linguistic background? What gender are predictive of the outcomes? We propose to expand this and to basically say, rather than a collection of 40, or in Brazil I heard sometimes, often 50 individuals, plus the teacher, rather than a collection, let's look at it as a system. And this sociological view then makes us want to think about, in addition to all the characteristic up there, to some data that has to do with the interactions among those individuals, the level of authority of the teacher, equity, most important, status, power and prestige, the structure of the curriculum, as well as the structure of the participation and the conditions of the implementation of the particular pedagogical method that you're looking at. In other ways, what we really want to do is open the black box of the classroom.
Eu vou falar agora só um slide, ó. Então, quem estiver quase dormindo nessas poltronas maravilhosas do cinema, o desafio de fazer no cinema é esse, né? Pode prestar atenção nesse slide só, meu, e não precisa prestar mais atenção quando eu falar de novo. Que ele resume a motivação por trás da escolha de tema que a gente fez, tá? Resume as nossas discussões e fala o que a gente vai apresentar, o que será que a gente pode contribuir para o debate atual de educação com a expertise que a gente tem. E aí fica o convite do Ricardo Henriques fez para a gente hoje na abertura. Vamos tentar conciliar visões, ouvir lados diferentes, encontrar caminhos. Então, ó, eu quero trazer duas referências para a gente. A primeira é pensar em dados. Então, vamos falar de dados. Pensar em dados como tabulações de desempenho de alunos em determinados conceitos. Da matemática, por exemplo. Essa tabela não vem de nenhuma prova específica, ela é puramente ilustrativa. Tem uma outra fonte de dados, que é a sala de aula. Todo dia tem muita coisa acontecendo na sala de aula. E essas duas óticas dos dados, elas se conectam bastante às duas visões que a Rachel trouxe para a gente, né? A gente pode pensar nos dados de avaliações padronizados como uma representação da visão do estudante individualmente, ou da sala de aula como uma coleção de indivíduos. E quando a gente olha para uma sala de aula com alunos interagindo em grupos, interagindo com materiais, trazendo seus problemas de fora da escola para dentro da escola, a gente tem muito mais dimensões de dados e a gente tem conexões entre esses vários indivíduos. Agora, vamos para a conciliação que eu gostaria de fazer. Nós temos ouvido, com cada vez mais frequência, no debate público, a seguinte proposta: precisamos levar os dados detalhados das avaliações padronizadas que temos no Brasil, que são maravilhosas, eu acho que a gente está muito bem, mas a gente tem que tentar ir a fundo e levar lá para o professor esses dados, detalhado, para ajudar o professor a ter ações pedagógicas baseadas neles. Esse discurso, nas minhas interações com professores e formadores de professores, não ressoa da mesma maneira que ele ressoa no debate público. Por quê? Professores e formadores têm falado: eu gostaria de apoio para entender a riqueza da minha sala de aula, porque uma tabela de desempenhos dos estudantes eu consigo levantar em um dia de aula. Os professores que já têm alguma coisa ativa acontecendo na sala de aula, no dia a dia deles, eles já estão observando se os estudantes estão ou não aprendendo a fórmula da área do círculo, por exemplo. Eu não preciso desse dado externo, ele não vai me adicionar nada se as coisas estiverem funcionando bem. Então, o que a gente vai fazer? A gente vai olhar hoje, a provocação é: será que tem outras maneiras para a gente apoiar essa busca dos professores pelo uso de dados e uso de evidências em educação, mas talvez fortalecendo a maneira com que eles conseguem usar os dados do dia a dia deles e não com essa adição de uma informação que é uma tabulação de dados? Essa é a ideia que a gente quer chegar no fim do dia. Será que a gente aproxima essas visões? A gente tem um caminho até lá.
Thank you, Fernando. So let's get back to what we talked about. What is learning? Well, I start here to say that lately and traditionally, we focused more on the cognitive aspect of learning. And lately, we have added the social and emotional activity of the student as an activity. It is important. And also, at least in the United States, I know I have to warn people a little bit, because now it has become kind of a phrase that doesn't have too much power, because it has been popularized and said, oh, well, we need to pay attention to the social and emotional activities and situation of the students. But we're still not completely sure what that means and how we do it. And it has become a little bit just a phrase without enough support by research in what it does exactly and how we do it. The other thing that we need to remember when learning is talked about is that learning occurs through interaction. It's the most important word that I can say. And it's interaction with others, with books, with materials all around, and of course, with the environment. Kids are learning incessantly. A more formal and very much research-based definition of learning comes from something called How People Learn volumes. And I will just show you one quote that I hope people can read, since I can't read it in Portuguese. And it is taken, oh, Mila says, be quiet, Rachel. Okay, all right. It is a quote from the second volume of How People Learn. Volume 1 and Volume 2 were produced by the National Academics. And it is, if you Google it, it's free. And you can download it. I don't know if it's translated, but it's a very serious kind of work. The first volume focuses mostly on the learning from a cognitive perspective. The second volume focuses very much, and very rightly so, on the sociocultural aspect of learning. And as I said before, it is kind of what many researchers and many theorists agree is what our current knowledge is about learning. And one of the reasons I brought it here today is because I wanted to brag. Because when I saw that the second volume actually mentions the methodology of complex instruction as a very useful and successful kind of methodology, I was very proud of that. So, if we now turn to talk about teaching as a profession, I usually start with two statements, and I say them as statements as it is, and I think we won't have time to discuss it, nor do I actually want to discuss it, because it's a statement. And I say that teaching is a profession. And so some people who think that just because they were in school for 12 years, they know how to teach, I think they are mistaken. And the other statement, very important statement, is that teaching is a moral and political act. And therefore, it has very serious consequences. What are the hallmarks? What are the commonplaces of a profession? This comes from a very extensive